Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Friday, the 8th of February, 2019. Well, for the second time this week, I'm basically stuck in my car doing the live stream, primarily because although I'm in East Lancashire, it's blowing an absolute hoolie here, just as it was in the south of England on Monday. And apparently, this is the forerunner to Tropical Storm Eric, which allegedly will bring gusts of some 80 mile an hour to the west coast of the country over the next day or so. Anyway, we shall see. But it's blowing a hoolie, it's pouring with rain, so frankly, I've decided to stay in the car. Anyway, this morning, the title of this morning's broadcast is A Special Place in Hell. And of course, this relates directly to the crass comments made by Donald Tusk in relation to the Brexit discussions. But before we get on to that, of course, I was expecting to be in Newcastle this morning to support Mark Steele in his appeal against his criminal conviction for allegedly using threatening behaviour against two local councillors. Well, the case has been adjourned or postponed pending the availability of witnesses, and obviously there are certain witnesses who weren't able to be present or weren't present at the original hearing, but these witnesses, particularly police witnesses, are considered to be essential if justice is going to be seen to be done, and those witnesses are not available. So my concern now is that we have no date for Mark's appeal against his criminal conviction, and a date has yet to be set for the committal hearing in which Gateshead Council are trying to get Mark jailed for allegedly breaching the terms of the injunction which was awarded against him. But of course, the injunction was purely on the basis of his behaviour, and so Gateshead Council are seeking to get him jailed on the basis of a couple of emails and a phone call. And of course, this is a prima facie attempt to shut down any discussion and debate over residents' concerns about 5G or LED street lighting. Well, literally just before I jumped into the car to do this broadcast this morning, a good friend of mine, Matthew from Wiltshire, sent me a link to an article which has appeared in this week's edition of the Somerset local press. It's also on Somerset Live. And the headline is Yeovil Western Corridor Roadworks, puzzled drivers hit by distracting strobe effect from streetlights. And here's the article. It's back to front, of course, if you're watching this on Facebook, I think. But anyway, let me just read you a couple of paragraphs here. Drivers have reported a bizarre strobe effect when driving through Yeovil's Western Corridor. Unusually low streetlights have been installed on part of an ongoing £14 million Western Corridor improvements projects, but drivers are not happy with the new addition. Local motorists say driving past the low-level LED lighting at night produces an off-putting strobe-like effect, which can be distracting when driving along the route. Well, of course, this is becoming increasingly evident, even on the motorways. The difference being is that the motorway streetlights are at least a bit higher. This is on the smart motorways. But these are apparently just 10 foot high in Yeovil. And the reason for that is allegedly that there's an airfield close by. But I must confess that, I do a lot of night driving up and down the country, and I have taken to wearing night driving glasses, overglasses, not just to cut the glare from the lights, these LED lights that are appearing on motorways, but also the effect of the glare from the LED headlamps in oncoming vehicles. And it's particularly the blue light frequencies that are a concern. And as I have observed many times previously, if you're using a Samsung phone, I know that they have a blue light filter. So go into your settings and make sure that the blue light filter is on. If you don't have a blue light filter on your phone, then there are apps that you can download to block the blue light frequencies, because these are the most damaging element of LED lighting, and the most concerning in terms of negative health effect. So I'll keep obviously everyone updated on what's going on with Mark Steele, but hopefully the appeal will be heard sooner rather than later, and hopefully the date for the committal hearing will be sometime in late March or early April, and hopefully at that point I'll be able to hook up with everybody in Newcastle as we demonstrate to the courts, to Gateshead Council, and certainly to the people of Newcastle and to the wider establishment, that there is an increasing awareness that the agenda of 5G and LED street lighting does not have the best interests of the wider population at heart. And the one thing that is becoming increasingly evident is that those who are defending LED streetlights or dismissing the likely impact of the 5G rollout, they basically haven't done their research, and they are simply trotting out the narrative of the establishment. And of course, if you go against that, we saw earlier in the week what happened to the student union representative who decided that he was going to speak out about the student suicides in Bristol, and he has basically been dismissed from his position because he claims that the number of suicides amongst students in Bristol University is somewhat greater than that is being officially reported. Meanwhile, Donald Tusk says that there is a special place in hell. He wonders if there's a special place in hell for those who led the UK to Brexit but have failed to prepare the country from its departure from the EU. Well, maybe there may be some basis for support of that sentiment, because there is little doubt that those who have taken on the responsibility, those who have put themselves forward as MPs, those who have identified themselves as the representatives of the electorate, have failed abysmally to carry out their responsibilities of public office. Because it is now 2.5 years since the country made it abundantly clear, when 17.4 million people stated that they wanted Britain out of the EU, and it was a straight majority vote. Now, of course, there are those who have been subsequently trying to retrospectively change the terms of that referendum, but the reality is that the majority of people who voted wanted out of the EU. Now, the only upside of this procrastination really is that an increasing number of people around the country have seen what a problem it would be for the British people to remain within the European Union. And so consequently, if there was to be a second referendum, which there won't be, but if there was to be, then there's little doubt in my mind that unless it was seriously manipulated, which is always a possibility, then the vote would be even greater to get the hell out of this totalitarian EU state. And, there have been a number of factors that have added to this strength of feeling. Not least, of course, is the fact that British politicians have demonstrated their complete and utter incompetence. And if they're incompetent now, what are they going to be like in the future, when basically there's nothing really for them to do except pretend to be MPs, because everything really comes out of Brussels? Well, it does now, but even more so. Well, the other part of this, of course, is the EU and their evident disdain for the British people, and of course their desperate attempts to claw as much from the British taxpayer as they possibly can before Britain finally regains its sovereignty. And last but no means least, the way in which the EU is behaving in France right now. And if anyone thinks that this is just Macron, then I think we may need to look at the bigger picture. And of course, if France decides to exit the EU, I mean, one of the founding members of the EEC back in 1957, if France decides that as a nation it wants to exit the EU, then obviously that is going to be really an indication that the EU is in total meltdown. And of course, the French and German establishments have done what they think they need to do by establishing the Treaty of Aachen, which is effectively a bilateral agreement within the EU. So one actually has to question the legitimacy of it. But it's clearly an attempt to take the first steps for the total integration and the re-establishment of a Franco-German empire. And of course, EU military union goes a long way towards that. So the special place in hell. Well, let's have a look at the EU track record, because of course they have destroyed the economies of Greece, of Spain, of Portugal, of Italy and Ireland. And for those of us in the UK, it's really quite staggering that the Irish have effectively acquiesced to becoming a total vassal state of the EU. I mean, I doubt that there are many people in Ireland who are aware, but Ireland is paying 16.5 million euros every single day, and that is just in interest on the bailouts that were forced upon the Irish government nearly a decade ago. But just let's have a look at what occurred in that period, because unemployment in Ireland in the 5 years from 2007 to 2012 went from 4.2% to 14.6%. And although the Irish economy appears on the surface to be significantly improved since 2012, the reality is that it is only improving on the back of increasing debt. So Ireland is effectively a vassal state of the EU and the IMF, and the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, is literally a charade. It's even more of a charade than Westminster, and that's really not saying much. And of course, another country that the EU has seriously impacted upon is Greece. And Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister briefly, who oversaw the Greek referendum in which the people of Greece resoundingly voted to reject the EU bailout terms. So Yanis Varoufakis had a mandate from his nation basically to tell the EU, the European Bank and the IMF to go take a hike. And, it was a great opportunity here for Greece to pull out of the euro, to re-establish the drachma. And Varoufakis was certainly more than capable of understanding, comprehending how fiat currency works, and for initiating an alternative new drachma. But he didn't. And in his own words, he says that, clearly Brussels just wanted to bamboozle him and effectively bully him and the country into accepting the EU bailout terms. So Varoufakis, needless to say, doesn't hold the EU in particularly high regard. And, there can be very little doubt, Donald Tusk, that there is a special place in hell, I'm sure, for those who have deliberately set out to destroy these nation states, to destroy their economies, and now be working almost tirelessly to destroy their culture. And the population of the UK has stated categorically that we do not want to be subjugated to a totalitarian corporatist state. which looks after a very, very small percentage of the population extremely well, pays those who carry out its aggressive policies enough to keep them quiet, but keeps a significant chunk of the population in absolute abject poverty. And, so here we are today on the 8th of February, 50 days, just 50 days before March the 29th. And that is the day when the UK needs to exit the EU. All of the rhetoric which is pumped out by the lamestream media, by the puppet politicians about needing to delay, about needing to negotiate. No, you've had 2.5 years to negotiate. Now, if you're not capable of doing what needs to be done, step aside and let those who do have the intellectual capacity, the intellectual capability, and the intellectual will to exit the EU step into those roles. Because if Britain has to step into a period of semi-isolationism, which it doesn't, because it will still be able to trade in many cases on much better terms under the World Trade Organization guidelines and tariffs than it can under the EU. The bottom line is that the EU leadership are beginning to realize just how significant the UK is in propping up the EU economy. And the bottom line is that the EU needs the UK a damn sight more than the UK needs the EU. And the way in which these negotiations have been treated, of course, is to some extent down to the fact that the EU negotiators knew very well that Theresa May, as an intellectual pygmy, just did not have the capability or the capacity to be able to negotiate in the complexity of the EU exit. So, all to play for, 50 crucial days. And then we have about another 40 odd days until AV10. And I'm sure that at AV10, we are going to have a lot of issues which maybe aren't even currently in our consciousness to discuss. So finally, this morning, let's just have another look at the mentality of the corporatists. And for this, let's take a look at the likes of Jim Ratcliffe, the Chief Executive Officer of INEOS, and Francis Egan, the Chief Executive Officer of a pygmy company by the comparison to INEOS of Quadrilla. Now, both of these individuals had recognized some years ago that there need to be very, very tight guidelines on seismic activity caused by fracking. And so both of these individuals and their companies signed up to the seismic limits, which were presented as a way of allowing fracking to continue in the UK following the seismic events triggered by Quadrilla back in 2011, when of course they also damaged their well. But now that Quadrilla have admitted that they were only able to frack to about 5% of what they intended at Prestonby Road, and in doing so, they triggered 57 seismic events, the most extreme of which was 1.5 on the Richter scale. But now both Jim Ratcliffe and Francis Egan are whinging to anyone that will listen that these seismic limits need to be lifted, otherwise they're going to lose money. Well, tough, basically. You knew what you were getting into, you agreed to those limits, and now you want everybody to go, oh, well, we can't have you losing money, can we? So let's increase the limits. Isn't going to happen. So get over it, because there's no way that Claire Perry or Greg Clark are going to raise those limits, because both of them know that if they do, their political careers are well and truly over. And, the people, particularly in Lancashire, have already been roughshod over because Lancashire County Council rejected Cuadrilla's initial application to frack at Prestonby Road and Rossiter. That was overturned by the MP for Deutsche Bank, Saeed Javid, who is only in Parliament to represent the interests of the global banksters. So he effectively overturned the Lancashire County Council decision. And now that Cuadrilla have demonstrated their absolute incompetence and inability to carry out unconventional gas exploitation without breaching these earthquake limits, they want the limits raised. So, and everyone knows that even if the limits were raised, they're still going to trigger events. And, then what are Jim Ratcliffe and Francis Egan going to say? Well, look, nobody died. Okay, a few houses fell down, a few hundred properties had their walls cracked. But look at what's gone on in Groningen. Yes, precisely. Look at what has occurred in Groningen in northern Holland. And that's not even unconventional gas exploitation. That's a conventional reservoir that has now started to cause, or the extraction has started to cause significant movement, and literally hundreds of properties are having to be condemned in northern Holland. So, if that's what people want in the UK, then obviously they would have let their MPs know that they were quite relaxed about the prospect of their houses falling down or cracks appearing in walls and ceilings, and that obviously on that basis there's no problem in raising the earthquake limit. But I think if there was a poll in these areas that are being targeted by the mother frackers, then they would be well and truly in favour of an outright ban. So, probably a special place in hell as well for those who hold the people of a nation or the people of a particular area in such disregard that their personal profit, their personal wealth is far more important to them than any respect for the lives and the property of others. So, my last observation for that special place in hell comes to those who continue to prevent effective medical treatments coming to market. And of course, I refer specifically to those in the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, that quasi-government department in the UK, where Tariq Sarwar, the head of operations, and Anthony Archibald, the former Surrey police officer, went after David Noakes and his team, who had managed to manufacture and distribute an extremely effective treatment for cancer, and that was GC-MAF. But behind them, of course, is Dr. Ian Hudson, who is going to stand down from the MHRA later this year, but he's been in the role of CEO at the MHRA since 2013. But prior to that, for 12 years, he was the director of licensing. And guess what? Before that, he worked in clinical research for SmithKline Beecham. Prior to that, he did his statutory 5 years in the NHS before realizing that there was far more money to be made by whoring yourself out to the pharmaceutical industry, and then effectively becoming chief enforcer to protect the revenue streams of the pharmaceutical industry by joining the MHRA. And you know what? There must be a very, very special place in hell for those who deliberately withhold effective treatments from their fellow man in preference for sustaining the profitability of the global corporatists. So we're coming to the weekend, and the countdown of minus 50 days to exiting the EU. Anyone who still thinks remaining in the EU is a good idea, please do your research. Look at the goals and the objectives of the EU. Look at the massive agenda to destroy the nation states and the culture of those nation states. And of course, mass migration is a massive part of that. And this isn't about a nationalistic agenda. It's about recognizing that each of the Northern European countries has limits on being able to sustain the well-being and the lifestyle of the residents of those countries. And this agenda to flood Northern Europe with migrants from, whether it's the Middle East or from sub-Saharan Africa, is the deliberate agenda to lower the standards of the working classes, to turn them into complete and utter abject slaves. So don't take my word for anything that I say. There's no need to do that, because everything I share with you, you can research for yourselves. And my thanks to the gentleman who called me last night, not realizing the number he was calling was mine, and then shared with me that basically, he has made it his mission to sow seeds, to not look for an instant agreement, but just to sow the seeds. And as time wears on, then there's no doubt that we will bring about the changes that we need to see. But unless people recognize that they have to get involved in this process, then sadly, it will inevitably get a lot worse before it gets better. And once the UK is out of the EU, let's make no bones about it, that there will be those who have every intention of accelerating the destruction of the UK, so that people in the country are gagging to get back into the EU. And at that point, basically, it will be game over, and future generations will be nothing more than vassal slaves to the EU corporatist state. You have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday morning at 8:30.